You've made a distinction between general arousal and sexual arousal. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, and then the ways that orgasmic meditation shares brain changes with familiar practices, or what seems distinct, and where would you say orgasmic meditation fit in terms of general arousal and sexual arousal?
Well, I mean, I think there is overlap between the two types of arousal. Again, our one of the things that we talk a lot about in terms of all the spiritual experiences is that there doesn't seem to be a separate part of our brain that turns on. There isn't when you walk into a church, there isn't a different part of the brain that opens up and starts acting, becoming active, and then it goes away when you leave. And so a lot of the experience of arousal does rely on the autonomic nervous system. It relies on some brain areas as well, including some of the dopamine areas of our brain that are part of the reward system, the limbic system, which is part of the emotional centers of our brain. But a lot of it really has to do with the limbic system and excuse me, with the autonomic nervous system, which is how we either begin to feel this sense of arousal because our heart rate increases and our blood pressure increases, and our pupils dilate and we become ready for action, whatever that action may be. And of course, sexuality and sexual stimulation is an important part of kind of using that autonomic nervous system. In fact, arguably, that's why we have the autonomic nervous system, in part for fight or flight, which is one of the critical pieces that we need to keep ourselves alive. And then also for sexual experiences and sexuality to have mating, so that we not just keep ourselves alive, but we create the next generation. And so in that regard, I think that when we look at what orgasmic meditation, kind of the mechanism by which it works, it seems like it starts with this sense of arousal, which again is not a surprise. There is sexual stimulation is a very strong activator of the autonomic nervous system, particularly the arousal system. So, I mean, that is part of how we are built. And in that regard, it's not just a kind of normal sense of arousal of, oh, I have to pay attention to my teacher who's about to give a lecture, or, this is a really interesting movie I've got to pay attention to. But we're talking about, a felt stimulation in the body, which becomes very, very intense and very strong. And of course, as I talk a lot about in Sex, God, and the Brain, I mean, sexuality is probably arguably one of the most powerful experiences that human beings have. It needs to be, because otherwise our species doesn't continue.
Right.
So, so that in that context, I think, orgasmic meditation has the ability to kind of utilize that arousal in a very intense way. You had mentioned things like whirling dervishes. I mean, that's another way of doing, you just get this incredible frenzied activity. We've studied speaking in tongues where people are dancing around and doing all kinds of things, so there's overlap there, but I think, ultimately sexual stimulation, again, arguably is going to be one of the more powerful kinds of stimulation that we have, because that's just how we're built. I mean, that's what one of the quotes that I had found when working on Sex, God, and the Brain was just about how, like everything that we do as human beings, our art, our literature, our music, and so forth, the driving energy is that mating sexual drive, because that's what leads to all of our creativity and so forth. So we're always trying to impress the other the other person. So that's a big part of it. And your question about where does it fit in with some of the other experiences that we've studied. I mean, I think that part of what is what we see in the brain scan are some of these same kinds of changes with regard to a decrease in the parietal lobe that we talked about, some decreases in the frontal lobe, that feeling of flow and so forth. And so on one hand, I think it helps people to have these kinds of experiences that seem fairly, comparable to other types of practices. Again, every practice has its uniqueness. So it's, and it'd be very difficult to take something which is not specifically religious and say, is it, it's not the same as a religious experience, because it doesn't have a religious component to it, but in terms of some of the basic elements, the sense of unity and oneness, connectedness, surrender, and so forth, there can be a lot of overlap. And I think part of what is always kind of an intriguing piece to all of these practices is, how are they kind of designed to enable people to have these experiences? And does it facilitate those experiences in one way or another? I mean, I think one of the so-called advantages of orgasmic meditation would be that it is a relatively defined practice. It has a very
Right.
specific timing to it. The timing is relatively brief. And so, that in and of itself might enable people to have very intense experiences relatively quickly in comparison to somebody who may need to meditate for 2, 3, 4 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
Again, you really can't get into better than, worse than.
Right.
It's just that, some people want to have a different kind of experience. And as again, going back to your psychedelic experiences that you were talking about, that's a very controversial aspect as well, because on
Yeah.
one hand, people describe them, as you said, as being incredibly spiritual. They are described as being the most spiritual experiences that they've ever had. And so for somebody who is a deeply religious or spiritual person, that might, not sit well. On the other hand, as I like to remind people, is that, throughout, the millennia and maybe throughout the eons of humanity, we've always been trying to find ways of stimulating these experiences. So whether we do it through magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, meditation, prayer, sexual stimulation, asceticism, no sensory perception, complete sensory perception. They're all different ways of kind of accessing those kinds of experiences, and there's never a one size fits all, but
Yeah.
as you look at these different practices, the ones that can utilize common elements of humanity, common elements of who we are as human beings, and common aspects of the experiences are probably going to be those types of practices that are going to be able to help people engage those experiences as effectively as possible.